Sometimes life decides for you when it's time to slow down. For me, that moment came with burnout. Years of working in New York City had drained me completely, and I chose to escape to my father's farmhouse in Vermont. It was a quiet, cozy place, perfect for recharging. Rolling green hills, an old barn, and a horse named Ridge, who was known as the wild spirit of the farm. My father always said no one could tame him, and I felt like I saw a reflection of myself in that stubborn stallion. The first 2 weeks after my move passed in quiet solitude. I settled in, read books, and occasionally worked in the garden. But that peace was disrupted by the arrival of my nephew Luke. We hadn't seen each other in 5 years, and in my memory he was still the lanky teenager who always teased me about my love for coffee. So when I opened the door and saw who was standing there, I was speechless for a moment. Before me was a tall, confident young man with a slight smirk and a look in his eyes that seemed to say, "I've seen a lot, Aunt Megan. Are you going to let me in, or should I spend the night out here in the rain?" He teased. We laughed, and the awkwardness of the moment melted away. Luke was nothing like I expected, and it unsettled me. He was no longer a boy, but a man with a broad smile and a quiet strength that was hard to ignore. Later that day, Luke noticed Ridge standing near the barn as if guarding the farm. "Is that your horse?" he asked, glancing at the stallion. "More like he's his own boss," I shrugged. "Ridge doesn't trust anyone." Luke took it as a challenge. By evening, he was standing near the barn with an apple in his hand, quietly whispering to the horse, who didn't even try to run away. I watched from a distance, surprised by his patience. Something about Luke had changed during the years we'd been apart. He was confident but not arrogant, kind, yet reserved. "He trusts you," I said as I approached. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be distrustful," he replied with a smile. There was truth in his words. Luke had come here to find himself. I could feel it with every passing moment. That night, we talked late into the evening on the porch. I learned he had graduated from college but had no idea what he wanted to do next. He felt lost, but here, in this quiet place, it seemed he was beginning to find clarity. The next morning, I woke to see him again standing by Ridge, offering him another apple. The stallion took a few steps forward and accepted the treat. It was the beginning of a bond one couldn't put into words. But deep down, I had a feeling that this summer would bring more changes than I could have anticipated. The sun stood high, bathing the green fields of the farm in golden light. It was the perfect day to spend outdoors. Luke insisted that we take Ridge out for a walk. I was hesitant. Ridge was known for his unpredictable temperament, and I didn't want anything to go wrong. But Luke was persistent. He fitted a bridle onto the stallion and confidently led him through the gate while I walked beside them, watching every move carefully. "Still don't trust me?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "I trust you," I shrugged. "But Ridge is a different story." He smiled, and there was something disarming in that smile. Luke walked with ease, his confidence unshaken even as Ridge's powerful muscles tensed with every step. We crossed a small meadow and stopped at the edge of a field where tall grasses swayed in the breeze. Luke tied Ridge to a tree, and the horse began grazing contentedly, clearly enjoying the change of scenery. "Your turn," Luke said, holding out the reins. "Is this a joke?" I asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "Nope. If you want to get to know Ridge, you have to get closer." I sighed and took the reins. As I approached the stallion, I felt his warm breath brush against my hand. He turned his head toward me, his eyes calm and patient, as if he were saying, "Go ahead, I won't bite." "See? He's not so bad," Luke said, leaning against the tree. We spent the next hour there. I fed Ridge apples and laughed at how he managed to be both graceful and stubborn at the same time. Meanwhile, Luke told me stories from his childhood, building tree houses in the woods and organizing bike races with his friends. His voice was deep and steady, and his words flowed like the warm summer day, filling me with a sense of peace. When the sun began to set, we decided to head back. Luke suggested we take a shortcut along a narrower trail. But suddenly, Ridge was startled by a loud noise. He jerked his head sharply and the reins slipped from my hands. I lost my balance and fell into the grass. Luke rushed to me immediately, helping me to my feet. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice both worried and gentle. "Yeah, just a little shaken," I replied, trying to smile. Our eyes met. His hands were still holding me, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The wind rustled through the grass, Ridge stood calmly nearby, and I could feel my heart racing too fast. Luke took a subtle step closer, and I realized I couldn't look away. His lips brushed against mine, light, almost imperceptible. It was so unexpected, yet it felt right. The kiss lasted only a second, but it left behind a sense that everything had changed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, looking away. "Don't be," I said, feeling warmth spread through me. We didn't say anything more. We walked back home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, but with a newfound understanding. Something between us had shifted, and it was impossible to ignore. The evening was quiet and cool. At sunset, when the sky turned a deep shade of crimson and gold, Luke suggested we light a bonfire in the yard. I brought out an old blanket for us to sit on while he gathered dry branches from the edge of the woods. Ridge stood peacefully near the barn as if keeping watch over us. The crackling fire cast a warm glow over our faces, and I wrapped myself in a sweater, trying to shield against the cool breeze. "Remember when we used to go camping?" Luke asked suddenly, tossing another branch into the fire. Of course, I smiled, recalling my childhood. "Your mom always forbade you from going near the fire, and yet you always found a way to break that rule. And you always took my side," he said, giving me a warm look. "I think you were the only one who really understood me." His words struck a chord. In the silence that followed, something new lingered between us, something I couldn't name but acutely felt. Luke leaned back against the wooden post while I watched the firelight dance across his face. He looked both confident and vulnerable, and for some reason that moved me deeply. "Have you ever felt like your life isn't really yours?" he asked suddenly, staring into the fire. "All the time," I admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just running away from something, even though I don't know what it is." "What if you're not running? Maybe you're just searching for the right place." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but every word echoed within me. My thoughts were a jumble. This wasn't just a conversation between two relatives. There was meaning in Luke's words that I couldn't ignore. The wind picked up, and I instinctively pulled the blanket tighter around me. Luke moved closer. "You deserve more than just running, Megan," he said, looking straight into my eyes. "You deserve to be happy." In that moment, my heart tightened. His voice was so sincere, so full of care, that I suddenly felt tears welling up. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He reached up, gently tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was so soft that I didn't pull away. His fingers lingered on my cheek for a moment, and I realized I didn't want him to stop. "Luke," I started, but he leaned closer, cutting me off. His lips met mine slowly, cautiously, as if he were waiting for permission. I felt his warmth, and for a second, everything else faded away. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a confession, a moment where words were no longer necessary. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine for an answer. "I'm sorry," he murmured, but I smiled and shook my head. "Don't be," I said. We sat quietly for a long time, watching the fire die down. There was a spark between us that couldn't be extinguished as easily as the flames. The next morning, the farm was wrapped in a soft mist that rolled gently over the hills, concealing the events of the previous evening. I stood by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, trying to process what had happened by the bonfire. Luke was sitting on the porch, lazily playing with a piece of straw that Ridge had pulled from his hay. There was a silence between us, not tense but different, as if we were both afraid to disturb the fragile balance. The quiet was suddenly broken by the sharp barking of our dog Jake. He dashed toward the road, where a dark figure emerged through the mist. The person walked with confidence, and within moments I recognized him. It was Trevor, an old friend of Luke's who had decided to make an unexpected visit. "Well, this is a surprise," Luke muttered as he stood to greet him. Trevor approached, his eyes scanning the yard with a strange mix of curiosity and tension. He and Luke exchanged a handshake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this visit would change something. "Thought I'd stop by. You said you'd be here," Trevor explained, nodding in my direction. The rest of the day was spent with the three of us together. Trevor told stories about his travels, joked around, but every now and then he gave me peculiar glances. When Luke stepped out to check on the barn, I was left in the kitchen with Trevor. He stood up, approached the table, and without hesitation said, "You and Luke. I saw you last night by the fire." My heart skipped a beat. "What did you see?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Enough to understand that you two are close." I didn't know what to say. The words were caught in my throat, and his gaze felt piercing. "I won't say anything," he added. "But Megan, this could end badly. You know that, right?" That evening, Trevor left, leaving behind an oppressive silence. When Luke returned, I told him everything. He was calm, but I could see a fire of determination in his eyes. "We can't live in fear," he said firmly. "None of that matters if we know this is right." We stood on the porch for a long time, watching the stars hide behind the clouds. Luke held my hand and his warmth seemed to melt away my doubts. "Luke, what happens next?" I asked quietly. "Next?" He smiled, and in that smile was more confidence than I'd ever seen in him before. "We live how we want to live. This is our life, Megan." In that moment, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Life doesn't always unfold the way you expect. Sometimes it throws unexpected twists your way, and sometimes it brings the right people into your life at the perfect time. Trevor might have been a threat, but his words only helped us understand that we were ready to fight for what we'd found. This summer had become the start of something new. We went back inside, leaving the starlight behind. Outside, Ridge snorted softly, and I knew this night would be different. The future was uncertain, but we had already made the decision to face it together.